Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Joe Chris, and I am from the not-for-profit social enterprise Opus Independence that produces and runs the Festival of Debate. If you haven't attended a Festival of Debate event before, we are a festival that's based in Sheffield that creates a platform to bring people together to discuss the key social, environmental, economic, political, and social issues of the day, and I'm very excited about tonight's event. Just a quick note to say Natalie is broadcasting from live and direct from a train this evening, so if her signal drops out, I might pop back up. But now I'm very pleased to introduce our host and chair for tonight's event, live and direct from a train, I believe, Natalie.
Indeed. Welcome everyone this evening, and apologies, I'm actually on a train between Brussels and Paris, so I think this is probably, I can safely say, a festival debate first. I was supposed to be in Paris 90 minutes ago, and you know, I spend lots of my time complaining about British trains, but my 3-hour plus and counting journey, I might complain about continental trains as well. But we're not going to talk about transport this evening, and I'm going to do my best to make this work anyway, because we've got two great speakers and a topic that I think we set this debate up 3 or 4 months ago. We could hardly have known just how utterly pressing and timely these issues are, with food security very much at the front of people's concerns and debate since Russia's attack on Ukraine and all of the consequent events following from that, both in terms of problems of food supply coming out of Russia and Ukraine, and also rising costs of energy, inputs for agriculture, etc. So I hope the audience will stick with us. We're going to sort of talk for about probably 40 minutes in total, have a conversation, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, or there's a chat box where people can introduce yourself if you'd like to say where you're coming from and what your interests are. In the meantime, what I'm going to do is, rather than do that boring bit where the host reads out the biography of the speakers, what I'm going to do is ask my two speakers to introduce themselves, say a little bit about themselves and their interest in this area, and also a question you might like to also bring up in the chat box. What's the best and worst food you've ever eaten? And I don't mean in this case necessarily the best and worst tasting food, but what was from the worst circumstances, the worst health factors. So Nikki, perhaps if you can introduce yourself and your best and worst food. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and also to Joe for getting us kicked off this evening. So hi, everyone. I am Nikki Yoxall. I'm an educator and first-generation farmer based in Northeast Scotland. I'm currently doing a PhD in agroecological transitions, and I'm really interested in things like holistic management, agroforestry, and connecting folk with their food. I also work for Pasture for Life as their head of research. So my job is to create links between academic research and farmers. And I also sit on the Nature Friendly Farming Network Scotland steering group and on the board of NatureScot. So I have quite a few hats that I wear. And in response to the question of the best and worst food, I think the best food I've ever eaten, the thing that immediately springs to mind is fresh tomatoes from my sister's garden in the south of France. But actually, I think it's anything that is produced off the land where you are. So that could be beef or from our farm, or cheese from a farm that you know well. Vegetables that are grown from the land, and yeah, having that connection to the space and the place that the food has come from. And I'd say the worst food I've ever had is probably when it's a ridiculous time at night and you're on a motorway somewhere trying to get somewhere, and the only food options are kind of bland beige foods. That's probably the worst foods I've eaten, when there's nothing else available and you're kind of stuck. So that's me.
Thanks very much, Nikki. And I think that worst is something we can certainly all very much sympathise with. And I personally am intolerant to gluten. And so I haven't known on many train journeys to have a packet of crisps and a packet of peanuts, which counts just about as 2 food groups, but is certainly not nutritious and involves lots of plastic as well. So Christian, if you can introduce yourself, say a bit about your interest in this area and your best and worst foods. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Hello, my name is Dr. Christian Reynolds. I'm from the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London. So I'm down in the open plan office there at the moment, but it's a pleasure to be speaking to you all. So I come from Australia originally, so my apologies about my accent. Sometimes my A sounds will come out a little bit weird. And I guess this is going to influence my best and worst foods. So my best food is probably peaches from my parents' backyard in Australia growing up. So definitely following kind of the style of Nikki, the best food, local, the sense of place, all of those different sorts of things. Having that, straight off the tree, no pesticides, etc. That sense of place, sun ripened, just a magical thing. Talking about magical things, talking about where I come from. So I grew up in Darwin in far northern Australia. It's a city in the north of Australia. It means all the food has to be road trained up, so driven up to Darwin or brought in via port. So if you're trying for different things, it's mostly brought into this town in the far north of Australia. And the worst food I've probably ever eaten is a Big Mac in Darwin. And I say that not just because it's an ultra processed food, but because of the time and the idea around it. So McDonald's came to Darwin, the first of its franchise. It had never been there, and they opened with a huge amount of excitement when I was 12. And as a 12-year-old, you've been absorbed in all of this, advertising all of your life, but never been able to experience. So I'd built the Big Mac to be something magical up. And I went with all my pocket money and I bought, I went to the counter and ordered a Big Mac, and I took it to the table and opened it and took a bite and realized it was beige, it was dry, and I really didn't like pickles. And so for all of those reasons combined, I think that's probably the worst food, just in terms of expectation versus reality, as for all of those other things. And I'm going to be excited to talking to you tonight about food, climate change, and the way we eat now.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. And I think you've just really given me my best McDonald's story that I might have to repeat and quote you on that one. And just to say that if anyone's out there wondering, that's also where my accent comes from, Australia, probably a bit stronger than Christian's, I suspect. And my best food has some similarities to his. My grandmother actually had a classic Australian quarter-acre block, and she grew fresh fruit and vegetables all over that. And my parents refused to eat them. They thought that the only proper food came from a supermarket wrapped in plastic and ultra-processed, so that you couldn't taste anything very much at all. But my grandmother, when I was about 5, gave me a fig from her tree. And it was the most magical thing I'd ever tasted. I don't doubt I'd tasted much in the way of fresh fruit and vegetables before that. And so I still remember the taste of that fig. So we've started with a few personal anecdotes, and it'll be interesting to see what other people's best and worst foods are. But what we're going to come to is now a chance to really get our teeth into the question of how do we eat and live. And so what we're really doing here is looking both at our food security, our food supply, healthy food, and how we live, of course, without our farming systems destroying our planet, wrecking our natural world. So I'm going to ask Nikki and then Christian to talk for each about 7 minutes or so. So we'll have a bit of an introduction to the topic and their perspectives, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Thanks very much, Nikki. Over to you.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm hopefully just going to share a PowerPoint that's just going to help keep me right in terms of what I'm trying to say. And so I'm really hoping that you can see that and that there's hopefully a picture, but somebody please shout if that's not what you're seeing. So I guess I want to...
You might want to make it full size, Nikki. Yeah, there we are. Well done. Yep.
Is it full size now?
It is now, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Natalie. So I want to share Michael Pollan's excellent words, which is eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. And I think if we can try and stick to that approach, then we're probably heading in the right direction. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a researcher doing a PhD in agroecological transitions, which is basically the how we look at the entire ecology of the food system, which is quite, I guess, the easiest way to think about it. And a lot of that comes back to this idea of food sovereignty and localized food systems. So one of the things that I think is always important to start with is the idea of local food economies. And a lot of the farmers that I talk to say that the thing that stops them from transitioning to a different way of producing food is the lack of a market. So regardless of whether we feel that the market the power of the market or the economy should be a driver, actually, in order to help farmers make that transition, we do have to pay attention to what that local food economy could look like. And by reducing the scale of these economies to much more smaller localized production systems, we have more flexibility, we have resilience to unanticipated shocks, and obviously we have the employment and support for producers that is much greater by distributing the price of food items more fairly along shorter supply chains, so that we don't have huge profits at one end and massive losses that need to be subsidized at the other. We also need to make sure that our food and farming systems are at best environmentally restorative and at worst benign. And at the moment, our systems very much are much worse than benign. They're extractive and destructive. So we really need to think about how we can mitigate climate change through lower greenhouse gas emissions, and not just through offsetting, but total emissions, actual reductions. Thinking about how we manage and conceive our systems. So thinking of them holistically rather than just in single reductionist metrics, such as we will follow this route because the emissions are lower, without taking into account things like biodiversity, soil health, animal welfare, water quality. So it's really important that we approach these complex systems with the complexity of thought and system design that they deserve. Food waste is obviously a really important asset, and I'm sure that Christian's going to touch on this, knowing his research interests. But agroecology, for example, really promotes these principles of circularity. So shortening the time between harvest and sales, reducing overproduction, which leads to losses in the supply chain. Decentralizing these systems really helps build those relationships between farmers and consumers, and helps to promote an acceptance of a variety of produce. So for example, as a small scale, very local beef producer, sometimes I might have issues around the types of steak that I'm able to sell my customers, just because of meeting demand with supply. But actually, because there's that really positive relationship, they're quite happy to maybe take a cut that they wouldn't necessarily choose, but they know that they're still getting a quality produce, and they know where that meat is coming from. We need to make sure that our food is healthy. The amount of funding that we put into producing food that then much later down the supply chain ends up causing issues to health is just this inconceivable kind of waste of money, and particularly when we think about the huge amounts of subsidized farming system that contributes to the growing of barley, which essentially then just goes into alcohol, and how the impact on the NHS much later down the line, and the impact on not just physical health but also mental health. Agroecologically produced food reduces these heavy metals, pesticide residues, and also has higher level of oxidants. So for example, in 100% pasture-fed beef, we've got a better ratio of omega-3 to 6, and increases in the amount of long-chain fatty acids. And there's lots of research out there to promote and support ideas around organic vegetables. And these local food models really help address both physical and mental health issues through that wider aspect of social connection and access to green spaces. So we want our food to be healthy and to be supportive of good health conditions, rather than being a cause for huge numbers of non-communicable disease issues and deaths globally. And it's really important that we think about the cultural significance of our food. And this doesn't just necessarily mean culturally appropriate food for individuals that dependent on their cultural circumstances, which is of course really, really important, but also supporting and valuing the connection between consumers and their food, strengthening that cultural identity of place and its people. And we've already heard both Christian and I have very strong connections to place in terms of our food memories, and enabling farming to become a dignified and sociable livelihood. And thinking back to the health aspect, at the moment, farming is one sector that has the highest risk of health in terms of health and safety, highest risks of death in the UK, and the levels of mental health issues that are becoming apparent in farming really is telling us that we have to do something to address these multiple crises that we're facing. So lastly, I just want to finish by saying that our food systems and the way that we think about food really going forward to make sure that we have a resilient system that is promoting good health needs to be integrated. Agroecological, which is a long and difficult word to say, and is something that I'm sure I'll be able to touch on later as we go through this evening session, and holistically managed systems. So thinking more about complexity and in the round than single reductionist measures. So that's me, and hopefully we'll be able to have a bit more discussion about some of these points as we go through this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Nikki. And I'd have to say that the cultural element of it was perhaps one that doesn't come up so often. And I think it's really important that. And also the point about overproduction. I'm reminded of when I visited Fair Share in Brighton, and one of the things they had was rack after rack after rack of perfectly good cauliflowers that had come from a supermarket that had just overordered. And if Fair Share hadn't rescued them, they would have gone straight to the tip, which is the most dreadful waste. So thank you very much, Nikki. And now, Christian, over to you. How do we eat and live?
Thank you very much for that introduction. And wow, Nikki, you've said it all, really. I have no idea where I'm going to be able to go after this. Let me see what I can do here. So I'm just going to share my screen now. There we go. So hello again. My name is Christian Reynolds, and I focus on a wide variety of things, and I have lots of opinions, as it were, about lots of these different issues, from local food through to rural transformations, through to food sovereignty, food democracy, food control. And my main focus is on healthy, sustainable diets, food consumption, and food waste. But I come from a lot of different backgrounds. And so I'm now down at City University of London, but was previously at the Institute for Sustainable Food up in the University of Sheffield as well. So big up for University of Sheffield there. But I think I'm going to focus a little bit even more in. So Nikki was taking this very big, broad approach. But to me, how we eat now, how we live now, there is one dominant thing. And I think we can spread it out further after this. But we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is climate change. If we don't solve climate change right now, there are going to be impacts both locally and globally. And the problem is we are now in a warming food system. There is on trajectory to be a 1.5 or 2 degree warming if we do everything right. And so what I'm showing on screen right now are the changes that we need to make if we do everything right to stay within a 1.5 to 2 degree food scenario. So a global impact. And so the two big things that we can do here, you can see on the screen, there are two red things on the waterfall chart, and those are the biggest positive reductions that individual citizens can make. The rest of this entire chart are changes that other things have to happen within the food system. But those two biggest changes that we as individuals can do ourselves and pressure other wider food system actors to do is, one, shift to sustainable diets, and two, reduce that overconsumption and reduce food loss and waste. And so let's start one of those with an easy one in terms of how we live now, how we eat now, and think about it. Because let's think about shifting towards those sustainable, healthy diets that are culturally acceptable, as Nikki was talking about there. And I want to highlight that there's lots of different pathways and solutions to that, because everybody in society is starting at different points. And by that, I mean that this is a image from the NDNS, the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, and it's looking across the bottom at the health of lots of different people in the UK's diet. So how healthy it is. Does it have 5 a day? Do they get enough wholemeal bread? All of those sorts of questions. So there's a score. And then on the other axis, it's got the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in each person's diet. And you can see in each of these different quadrants, there's people with different sorts of diets. Some have more fruit, some have more meat, all of these different things. But you can see people who are high greenhouse gas and healthy diets need to do things different to people who have low greenhouse gas but unhealthy diets. So there's not one path and one set of actions that we need to do. So let's start with an easy thing in terms of shifting dietary patterns. Well, one of the things we can do is increase our fruits and vegetables. And that's a thing across the board that I stress we do, because as Natalie would say, but she's in the EU currently, in the EU, and this is before the UK left, 34% do not have enough fruit and veg on a daily basis, with over half people having less than 4 portions on a daily basis. And it's still 5 a day that we need. So even if you're thinking about everyone needing to get to that 5 a day for health reasons, let alone for sustainability. And the big news is that you can increase the healthiness of your diet, and that'll increase sustainability. And so if you just eat your food-related dietary guidelines, that's even starting to reduce the environmental impacts. And this all came to a head in 2019 with the release of a thing called the Eat Lancet. And the two big things that they said for having a diet within planetary boundaries was, one, increasing fruits and vegetable consumption dramatically above 5 a day, and two, decreasing animal products, but not excluding animal products. So those are two different things that we can do to help stop the climate catastrophe, but also to be changing wider for that's things around land use, that's things around water use. These two actions are two of the foundational things that we can do. And that's part of my message around how we live and how we could eat now and eat into the future. But how can you imagine that? There's lots of different routes that could be. So let's think about this: increasing fruits and vegetables and reducing meat products. And so there's lots of different ways that could happen. That could be changing, as Nikki was saying, the cut you have. So you have a small 70 to 90 gram piece of red meat once per week. That could be chopping it up into a 28 gram of beef or other red meat into different sorts of dishes throughout the week. So a much more Asian style of cooking. Or you could be thinking of adopting a more ultra-processed style of eating. We'll probably touch on ultra-processed food later, but you could be blending things together. So you could take the meat, take mushrooms and blend them together to create a new product, or other sorts of protein together to create a new product. Those are three different types of futures that we could have in terms of thinking about our daily meat consumption. So we could be having less meat, but better meat, and how that actually eats. So there's lots of different ways and directions we could go with that. Now, for the last 2 minutes, I'm just going to also highlight that this Eat Lancet report didn't have all the answers. And I think Nikki and Natalie just touched on it there in terms of thinking about cultural significance. So we have lots of local and traditional diets, foodways, and systems of production that work in different parts of the world. We have the peaks, which means that we have areas of land that are specifically good for grazing animals. They're not good for a tractor, which means we need to be growing what we animal agriculture in specific places around the world and tailoring that agriculture. But in the Eat Lancet report, it also missed other sorts of discussions. And so a new report has come out by the Barilla Foundation called the One Health Approach to Food. And they made these two pyramids, as you can see on the bottom of the screen, that highlighted sustainable food and healthy food and how you eat within those two for 9 different dietary patterns around the world. So we've started to investigate this. How should we eat globally and how should we eat in Sheffield to a much more granular degree than we have previously. So we don't have all the answers yet, but part of that is increasing our fruit and veg and decreasing our animal product production, but making sure that animal products, when we do eat it, are healthy and sustainable and helping the local economies. And I'll finally say one of the things that wasn't considered in the Eat Lancet, and this is kind of where I get really excited, is thinking about the cooking of the food. Because most people, in say their environmental impacts of food, think about it up to the supermarket. But what I get excited about is thinking, how do we use those things? How do we cook those things? And what are the sustainable recipes afterward? And so when I think about how we eat now and how we live now, the big news is that old-fashioned ways of cooking, such as oven cooking, are both horrendously bad in terms of energy generation, because you're filling a giant box full of hot air to cook something in the oven. If you're a single person or a small amount of people, cooking in an oven is very inefficient. And so that means that it's costing you more energy, which is costing you more money with these price rises, but it's also more environmental impacts. So if you're baking a single potato in an oven, the environmental impacts of the cooking are 60% of the environmental impacts of that potato serving just in the oven baking. So thinking about how you can change your cooking habits to be much more sustainable. So definitely we can think about cultural shifts, but also about dietary shifts. And again, I'm going to stop sharing now, but please do start putting questions into the chat about any of these things. And I'm sure we're going to cover lots of the different things that Nikki introduced in her first set and thinking about how we can go through them in real life as well. But I'll hand back to you, Natalie and Nikki.
Thank you very much. And I think a huge amount of information and thought and really different perspectives there, which is really great to see. And we've already got a couple of questions in the Q&A box, but a reminder to everyone, people participating, to have a chat in the chat box. But I'm just going to pick up something that both of you touched on, I rather suspect we might have some people on this call who'd be questioning the place of meat and meat in both our food production systems and our diets. So, Nikki, you do work for Pasture for Life, so I think that kind of gives us a bit of a hint there. But if I can put it to you, where does meat and dairy fit in our diet? And then I'll come to Christian also as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and yeah, it's fascinating. And as a beef farmer who was vegetarian for many years, I think I'm probably quite well equipped, not only in terms of my work, but also in my kind of own shift that I've gone through to answer this question. But obviously, from a very personal point of view, I think that there are a couple of things, and one Christian mentioned, which was about how there are different types of land use, and there are particular areas where I live, which is 300 meters above sea level in upland Aberdeenshire. It's really not the best place to start trying to grow crops and the types of weather that we have and the conditions that are here. But actually what's really brilliant here is the diversity that we can achieve in our species rich pasture, which is actually, we've lost in Scotland 50% of our species rich pasture since the early 1980s. It's in huge decline, and we're at risk of having almost none of it left by the end of the century. So for us, one way that we can manage that and we can enable that species richness to increase is by integrating cattle as ecological engineers into that system. We use a silver pastoral system, so the cattle are grazed in trees, as you'll have seen from the final photo I shared. And we're really thinking about this kind of integrated stacked system that helps us to enable and shift ecological processes along, but also make sure that we can produce a product that is really culturally significant in this part of Scotland. And the beef production here is really seen as something that is part of the cultural heritage. And again, it's coming back to that idea of our social norms. And the other thing that I think is becoming increasingly apparent is the way that we need to grow food requires fertilization. And there are some really great examples of veganic systems, but they are often operating on quite a small scale. And what we do have at the moment is an issue between the majority of ruminant livestock production in the UK is in the West, and the majority of our cereals and arable and horticultural production is in the East. And we have these real challenges between moving the fertility across the country. And so then what we do is we rely on nitrogen fertilizer and other synthetic fertilizers, which are now hugely expensive, up to £1,000 a tonne, when at the start of the year they were hovering around £200 a tonne. So suddenly financial sustainability is going out the window. And with those issues around the extractive nature of synthetic fertilizers, the way that they're produced, they're based in fossil fuels, and the emissions that result from their use, maybe one thing that we need to do is think about our livestock actually serving more than just a food purpose. So rather than having animals in feedlot systems, which do exist in the UK, eating grain and molasses and leftover Yorkshire puddings that have not been deemed fit for human consumption, actually maybe we can utilize those animals in a way that helps to enable that nutrient cycling, and so that they can go onto farms where they're able to graze, and their dung and urine brings back that nutrition that's needed in the soil to enable a biologically active soil that can grow the next crop for human consumption. And really moving away from grain-based diets for ruminant animals, because they are brilliantly adapted to only need to eat grass. But it's our kind of social constraints that we put on that, how we want those animals to finish, and how we want the consistency of the meat to be to fit into this kind of homogenized food system. So I'm trying to get through lots of points very quickly there. I guess the bottom line is that I believe that ruminant livestock absolutely have a place, both culturally and in terms of the role that they can play in a really healthy and sustainable farm system. But like Christian says, maybe we just need to think about how much of that we're eating and where that food is coming from.
Shall I jump in immediately there, Natalie, or do you want to come back in?
Christian, if you could, I think you sort of set out where you thought meat should be. How would you defend that from someone who said, well, there just shouldn't be any meat or dairy in there at all?
Okay, let's do some debating there. So I think, so my own personal view is we need, if we're wanting rural economies, if you're wanting cheese, if you're wanting any sort of thing, you need other sorts of meat in there. So just kind of putting my own view there, but also if we're wanting to defend that and push back, and Nikki is right in terms of we need certain fertilizer stakes in terms of fertilizer generation. And so I was nodding without the camera on there. But the current Haber-Bosch process for creating synthetic or artificial fertilizers is very energy intensive. However, there are more renewables, and as more renewables become on the grid, it means we actually is a less carbon intensive thing to produce more artificial fertilizers. And so there could become a tipping point soon, which you could say we can fertilize using renewable energy that we have. And in those sorts of situations, then that some people are highlighting that you don't need as many animal livestock on there. The other thing, as Nikki highlighted, is that animals currently, there's a large amount of animals in the UK and globally that are fed on grain-based, not pasture-based systems, and also even pasture-based systems over winter sometimes use grain-based feeds as well. And so if we're thinking about a truly pasture-based system which has no grain, that's going to have a different land use footprint, but also a different scale. And so I think if we're wanting to defend this in terms of if we're saying we don't want any sort of animal-based agriculture here, it's possible, but would require drastic changes of diet and also employment practices in multiple different parts of the world, including the UK. And so I was involved in a thing which was called the National Food Strategy, which was published last year, and hopefully the government will respond very soon with its white paper to the National Food Strategy. But I was involved in the community forums that were held across the UK. And in these forums, we went to different communities and said, what are their, what do you want land to be used like? What do you want to do in terms of your involvement with nature? So this wasn't just farmers, this wasn't just fisher folk, this was people from across society saying, what do they want to see when they look out the window? Would you like to see less pasture, more forests, for instance? So if we rewilded everything, which is in some ways what the new Elms scheme is looking at, bringing back different parts of pasture and different parts of other farming stock to more nature or biodiversity, would that be better? And there was a wide range of opinions and a wide debate about this within the UK. And so I think in terms of wanting to keep jobs in agriculture in the UK and rural communities alive, animal husbandry and animal-based agriculture is part of that. But of course, if we're wanting to change to be a totally non-animal based system, that is going to have a definite change to what our rural economies and what even our city economies actually looks like. And so it might not happen overnight, but just bouncing off what Natalie said there to prompt, it could happen, but it's going to be a drastic change. And so I think I'm very much less than that, saying the scale at which Nikki can operate and a pure pasture farm can operate is at a very different scale of animal agriculture compared to a grain-based scale. And Nikki, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But also in terms of the costs for that, and I know the cost of living is something we've all become much more topical about, but if we're thinking of the price chicken has dropped to over the last 30 to 40 years, forcing other protein producers to compete. So lambs, for instance, they've had to cut their costs to compete with chicken. And so lots of different meat can be much higher welfare, much more sustainable, much more money for farmers in the pocket to have better rural communities if we're charging more for meat. And if we're thinking about this in terms of, I guess, how meat used to operate in different parts of society, we used to have meat much less frequently and in much smaller amounts than we did from 1950 to, say, so post-rationing 1958 through to 1970s. That's where our meat habit has been picked up. And so we're only thinking in the last 70 years, we can change this, we can change these sorts of things, but we need to be paying more for our meat if we want those standards. And that's a really hard needle to thread, as it were, in terms of thinking about the rising cost of living right now and equitable and just amounts of protein in the system, considering lots of plant-based diets, if they're not ultra-processed, are actually much more time intensive and much longer to cook at this present time. I think I've gone slightly off topic there. Is that okay, Natalie? Nikki, is that okay with you, or what do you think?
It's great with me, thanks. And I'm going to come back to you, Christian, in a sec, because coming at the other side of this, There's the question of, I very often say, some people on this call may have heard me say it before, that Greg's vegan sausage roll is not an answer to anything. One of the things that led me to invite you to speak on this event, Christian, was a paper that you wrote on ultra-processed foods, something that's of great interest to me as I'm trying to get the government to acknowledge it's an issue. So, Christian, can you set out what ultra-processed foods are and what issues you see around them? So, on to the ultra-processed angle. Thank you.
Okay, let me just highlight what ultra-processed foods are. So this is kind of highlighting a little bit of a different thing that we're discussing, which is the processing of food. So I'm just going to share my screen again. So give me 1 second. And so ultra-processed foods, there's different levels of processing that have happened in terms of food production. And so if we're thinking in terms of ultra-processed food, this is a classification system that has come out of Brazil called the NOVA classification, which is one of the classifications that's been brought about. But group 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed food. So this would be things that you could recognize very easily and you'll definitely have in your cupboards at home. You then have group 2, which is processed culinary ingredients. So this could be things that have a minimal amount of processing. So olive oil, cream, butter, lard, maple syrup, all of these things have had some sort of processing that can be done with the tech that you have in your homes. So there's drying, grinding, milling, things that, your grandmother would recognize. As Nikki had a quote from Michael Pollan, eat greens often, don't eat food your grandmother wouldn't recognize. She would recognize everything in terms of group 2 ultra processed foods. You then have group 3 processed foods. So these are canned, these are pickled. These are things your people before you would recognize, but they've got salt, they've got things added, but you could actually do this at home if you followed guidance and it would be safe and healthy to eat. And then ultra processed 4 is this is the ultra processed group 4, and these have additional things added to them or would be hard to create in a home environment. So these have extra preservatives or are reconstituted. These are things that have things in them to extend shelf life. And so this means that there are more technical commercial processing going on to extend the shelf life, increase chemical modification. And this means that even though it might say pumpkin soup or chicken nugget, there is a distinct change between the chicken or the pumpkin in group 1 and what it is in group 4, which means that it's more nutritionally light and calorie dense. So there's less vitamins, minerals, etc. within that product in its state unless it's been fortified. So just highlighting that complexity there in terms of what ultra processed food is. But why is that actually an issue? I hear you cry, as it were. Well, the problem is that in multiple countries, the amount of calories from ultra processed foods is rising. So you can see here, I'll just bring up this graph seamlessly, 1 second. Ultra processed foods in terms of energy in different countries, as we've become, I guess, more modernized, our food systems have changed and we've become a more globalized food system, which means we're importing more of these long life foods, shelf stable foods. So you can see here in this graphic that in the United Kingdom, over 20% of our calories, this is an old estimate, sorry, over 50% of our calories come from ultra processed food in the average diet. And our obesity rate is around 20-25% there. And you can see here, there is a trend in terms of the differences between percentage of energy intake from ultra processed food and the obesity rate. So that means that increasing dietary share of ultra processed foods leads to increasing share of other health problems. There's a correlation there. But that's not all, folks. I think the main thing that Natalie was wanting me to highlight was a final thing, which is highlighting that in ultra processed food itself, let's just go to the next slide. I'll just share screen again. In ultra processed foods, there's different sorts of foods in your diet committing to different environmental impacts. And this is a study from Brazil, but we found very similar things happening in the UK and Australia and around the world. It's where ultra processed foods over time have become more and more in the share of diet. So you can see here in Brazil in the 1980s, these processed foods, so processed bread products, soft drinks, chicken nuggets, sausages, all of those sorts of things, only 10% of the energy density. But by 2017, it was 23% of the energy density. It was the growing part of energy coming into our bodies, so in terms of calories. But you can also see here, disproportionately, those calories are attracting a larger amount of environmental impacts, because what's happening is it's the ultra-processed meat products. So the bacons, the ultra-processed sausages, all of those sorts of things are knocking out fruits and vegetables from the diet, or knocking out other sorts of minimally processed or culinary ingredients coming in there. So that's what's decreasing, is these minimally processed foods, the whole meal foods, and that's increasing the environmental impacts of our diets. And that's what's truly terrifying here, is that our dietary footprints are increasing and our ultra processed food is increasing as well. And you can change your diets by shifting back towards more whole cuts of meat or more fruits and veg. And I think that's what Natalie was wanting me to highlight there, hopefully, is that there's this complexity around ultra processed food. It makes up 50% plus of the energy in the UK diet, but it's also got these environmental impacts and health costs associated with it more widely. Is that what you wanted me to say, Natalie?
Well, thank you very much, Christian. And I think that was a very clear introduction to that. Nikki, your initial presentation very much focused on cultural aspects of food. And I wonder what your thoughts are about the cultural place of ultra-processed food in the British diet. There's a figure around I've seen of 68% of our food our calories come from ultra-processed food. Your perspective on how we eat what I would call perhaps real food, and what the impact of ultra-processed food perhaps also is on farmers, and the lack of relationship we might have with farmers.
Yeah, I definitely have real concerns about the amount of ultra-processed food that's being eaten. But one thing that I really want to pick up on here is that, there's a massive issue around the cost of living. And for those folk who are experiencing poverty, ultra-processed food offer quick, easy, limited decision-making choices, or limited decision-making capacity choices to get calories in and be able to go about your day. And I think that, this is where the food system discussion actually expands out to be more about how we address inequalities in society. So, for example, people will often talk to me as a farmer and have that conversation about, which is exactly what I think, which has been picked up in the Q&A, a point from Danny, who has said about the impending food supply crisis. Do we see a point when the cost of production of food as we know it is so high that people won't be able to afford food that we currently eat lots of, and farming becomes untenable? I think we're already there, that for many farmers it's becoming untenable as a business, and we're just seeing the shock on shock on shock of all of these different issues that are impacting on the system. And one of the real challenges that we have when we're asking people to change what they're eating is that they can't afford to do that, not because of the price of food. We have some of the cheapest food in the world, and we spend a tiny proportion of our income on food compared to many other countries. But it's about the wider cost of living that are crunching people's ability to spend on food and to make decisions around food that are better for health or better for the environment. And I'm very aware that I'm straying into Christian's area of expertise here, but for me, it's a very prominent part of how we farm, and it's something that it really concerns me, that I can ask all day people to eat, cheaper cuts of meat, and to buy those and to cook them along with, really healthy vegetables. But if those people can't afford to pay for the electricity to heat that food, or they are struggling to manage 4 different jobs and childcare, and they just don't have the decision-making capacity to think about having to cook a particular meal, or they're not able to plan because they've got all of these other things that are going on. Actually, those are the real issues here. It's not really about whether people have access to or not ultra-processed food. It's about the issues around all of the other things in life, stopping them from being able to make fair, safe, healthy, environmentally sensitive decisions. And so I think it's really important that we don't talk about food without mentioning societal inequality, which is leading to people making decisions that are not good for them, and that also continue to put profits into the pockets of people who are continuing to produce these ultra high processed foods. So I want to hand over to Christian, who I think can give a much more scientific reflection on my points there.
No, totally. I've been nodding off camera, and I thought I would come on camera to nod exactly along with you, Nikki. So firstly, I totally agree with everything you said, which is probably not going to be an exciting festival of debate for the audience. I apologize about that. But I also think it is right to highlight this lack of justice in the food system and this friction and the shocks that farmers are facing, and to highlight that for many, ultra-processed food is in the diet because of its cheapness, because it is shelf-stable or has a longer shelf life, therefore reduces the environmental impact. It reduces the amount of food waste. It is a known product. It is available everywhere. There are many positives around it. Health outcomes are not one of them, but at the same point, there are multiple other factors to consider. So when I first moved to the UK from Australia, I moved to the Rowett Institute up in Aberdeen, not very close to where Nikki is. And I was working on a research project looking how low income and everybody in Scotland could afford a healthy, sustainable diet. And one of the solutions was, of course, spend more money or reallocate, food to these different points. And it came across in that exactly what Nikki highlighted, that in the UK, we have some of the lowest amounts of spending on food for a developed country in terms of, between 8 to 11% of our incomes, this is 2015 numbers, of course, but 8 to 11% of our incomes typically was spent on food. That's really small for a developed country. In other places, we're talking 15 to 20% typically. That's more typical, 15 to 20% income on food. So 8 to 11% was peanuts. I could not understand how the UK was able to do this. And as has been shown in the media, this is because of lots of factors, from supermarket power through to preferential trade policies, lots of different things happening there, keeping down the cost of food. And we're now starting to see it ramp up as we did in 2008. But as Nikki said, it's definitely a wider discussion there around societal. So it's about cost of energy. It's about time costs. So you can be time poor, cash rich. You can also be cash rich, time rich, but you can also be cash poor, time poor. You're working 4 jobs. You don't have time to think. You don't have the emotional energy. And you're risk averse in terms of not wanting to buy things your children won't eat. And so there are lots of different solutions we need here. And one of the most interesting things we could be thinking about or talking about is universal income as part of this, or different sorts of income strategy and wider food system or wider social policies that also lead to healthy, sustainable dietary outcomes, not just fixing things on farm, not just fixing things with advertising or banning buy one, get one frees. We need to think about policies that work across multiple different aims, including social justice, including equity, including environmental outcomes. So I think there's lots of different things we need to be thinking about there. And there are lots of dietary solutions for that, both in the public sector as well as the private sector. But just to highlight, and I'm agreeing with everything that Nikki's saying there, but this cost of living crisis is exacerbating things, A, because of supply chain, B, because of power, energy prices just rising and rising. And in August, we'll see that happen again if the rates are not cut. Currently, it's 50p to turn your oven on. If you're on your current rate, 50p to turn your oven on for an hour with the average oven in the UK. In August, it's going to go up again. So if you're thinking of a ready meal that needs to go in for an hour, that's going to be an extra 50p on that ready meal for, pensioners who are maybe don't have the most equipment. So we need to be thinking about all of these different factors in thinking about that just food system. So I definitely think in terms of policy solutions, there's multiple things here, including income support, including changing access to food. There's lots of different discussions we could be having here and lots of different policy solutions we could be thinking about. I think I've gone on a soapbox. I should let Nikki or Natalie start talking.
Well, I'm just going to come in and, as chair, agree with everything that the 2 speakers have just said. And indeed, what Brian Hart said in the chat, applauding the reference to universal basic income. And I'll also note the fact that people might remember the horse meat scandal from a few years ago. And one of the things that exposed was the fact that in the UK, we eat twice as many ready meals on average as the rest of Europe does. And not coincidentally, we also have the 2nd longest working hours in Europe. And we also had, pre-COVID at least, on average twice as long commuting time as people in continental Europe did. So these are systems thinking issues. But I just do want to pick up something else from the Q&A that Reinhard also put in the Q&A. I think is an issue people often puzzle over, the issue about local food and the environmental impacts of local food, and how do we weigh local versus organic from overseas, etc. So Nikki, if I can sort of give you a chance to pick up local food, and then Christian, I may have to drop out, so if you could just come in straight after. So Nikki, how much do we need to focus on local versus the kind of production system and things from far away? Thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm probably the worst person to ask, because I calculated that the amount of food as a percentage in our households that we eat that doesn't come from the UK is something like 6.5%. So we are pretty committed in our house to not eat anything that isn't from the UK, unless it is things that we can't get elsewhere, that we can't grow here, and generally would need to be purchased in a dry state, so that we're not importing water. I think that's a really important thing that often gets lost in the debate, is importing water from arid and water scarce regions. So I think the question was, should we be eating oranges and pineapples? I can't tell you when I last ate an orange or a pineapple. So my personal view is that, yeah, I think we should be stopping bringing in these fruits. However, we also have to reflect back again on the issues around on the social justice issues around making sure that people, particularly children, get enough access to fruit and vegetables. And we have to remember that we've almost become spoilt for choice. We can get blueberries, strawberries, apples, oranges, mangoes, you name it, at any time of year, whenever we want them. And I think asking people to suddenly change that shift back to something that is more seasonal and that is more local, and sometimes requires different ways of thinking about your food and different ways of cooking food, and often is less about sweet fruits and might be more about more savoury vegetables, can be quite a difficult shift to make. So I definitely think that there is scope here for us to think more about how we use our urban and peri-urban spaces to grow fruits, particularly in ways that we're not maximizing at the moment. And that might be hydroponically. And although my entire farming system and ethos is very much based in the soil, I do recognize that there are people who need and want to have access to different types of fruits. And so absolutely growing them in different ways might be an appropriate approach to take. We do not have enough food production happening in and around our towns and cities. And any way that we can try and increase that and is only going to be a good thing. And it would be really interesting to think about how, particularly in this part of Scotland, in northeast Scotland, we have a huge soft fruit production farms, but most of them are growing strawberries or raspberries, for example, on tables on top of really productive agricultural land. What we could be doing is moving those soft fruit production systems that don't rely on the soil underneath into more urban areas, and then the lands that they've come off could actually be used for growing food that does need to be grown in the soil. So I think there are different ways, again, around how we think about land use, how we consider choice and whether that's important or not, but also how we help people to have a little bit more education around the types of food that they might need to eat, and they might get a little bit bored with eating similar foods all of the time. And I think this is where things like CSAs, community supported agriculture schemes, come in, and working more closely with local producers to access those foods. But Christian, do you want to jump in? You might have a different view on oranges and pineapples.
Thank you very much. And it's quite hilarious. My first slide I was going to bring up on local food is actually exactly on that topic of urban food systems. And so I'll jump straight to the second one there in terms of thinking about this, but just relating the story. So again, I've been up to Aberdeenshire, I've worked up there. If you look historically, that land that Nikki is talking about that now has soft fruit used to be apple and pear orchards. And those were all pulled up in the 1950s and 60s to put in that soft fruit. And we lost lots of genetic variety there and went to a totally different system of production. And that's part of the amount of money a farmer could get compared to apples and pears compared to soft fruit. They could get more for soft fruit, but we lost all this other life around apples and pears, and other food, as Nikki could be saying, could be grown in different parts. And I'll now just share a slide here to highlight this locality. So I'm doing some work at the moment for Zero Waste Scotland, mapping out the Scottish food system and also thinking about the UK food system and thinking about what it means to have a local diet. thinking about COVID, thinking about Brexit, and thinking about urban food security. So this map I have on screen right now is called Chrome. It's the crop map of England. What they've done is they've taken satellite photos by the Sentinel satellites, and they've used some machine learning to actually figure out what is grown on every metre squared of England. There's also one for Scotland. There's also, other maps as well, but I'm just showing this one. So this basically shows every part of this. And this shows what Nikki was talking about in terms of where different things are, in terms of where pasture is, where cows are, where the horticulture and where the wheat crops are grown on the UK. But the big thing about this is it's not just thinking about, shall we say, where things are grown, but we need to think about supply chain complexity. So that's where are the cows taken for abattoir? Where is the grain taken for milling? All of those things matter in this local food system. And I think the question about should we be eating pineapple, should we be eating bananas? Well, you can see here that only 17% of the fruit for the UK diet is grown within the UK, and that's because of tropical fruit. That's because of bananas and pineapples. So we can be thinking about what we can grow in those UK urban areas, e.g. 50% of urban areas are green space. We could be converting that to food. But and Nikki was right and smacking the nail on the head in terms of what could we actually grow there. So we could be doing salads, we could be doing soft fruits, we could be doing mushrooms, different sorts of things can grow in urban areas. So we can be changing that, but there's also a dimension of choice there. But I also want to highlight the scalability of this. And Nikki started touching about this, and I really hope it is the next slide. So thinking about how and where we purchase these different sorts of things as part of a local food system. So it's not just saying we don't want to buy bananas or we don't want to buy pineapples, because there are communities globally that are reliant on producing those for their income. So there's a definite moral dilemma we need to be thinking about between if we stop purchasing these different foods that are produced for us, what happens to those communities where that is their main income globally around the world? We need to think of ourselves as global citizens as well as local citizens and think about those right things. And so we need to also be thinking about if we're part of a local food system, where are we buying that from? And so you can see, and I take this long temporal view, sorry if you're colorblind, but the pink line on this graph, you can see it's rapidly decreasing. That's all the independent high street traders who are the ones likely to get things from the local food system. There's been a decline since the 1970s in local, and all of the supermarkets have been increasing market share year upon year. But you can see here on the right, figure 10 from the Food Standards Agency, where are you buying most of your food from? And you can see here, which has been a rapid transformation since COVID, is that supermarkets, 79% of people are engaging with supermarkets at least once a week. But the big thing for me is that 9% of people are now engaging with local food systems, farmers markets, farm shops, and 3% are getting recipe boxes, community-supported agriculture, lots of things delivered on a weekly basis. That's a huge change compared to 2020, now in 2021, and we know these numbers are growing. So engaging with small shops, 37% are doing that on a weekly basis. Independent greengrocers, it's now at 26%. So this means there's a resilient undercurrent happening in our food system there. And we need to be engaging more in these things in terms of talking about what we want to see there. So yes, it's about changing what we eat, but also changing how we shop, how we cook, all of these different sorts of things. So I know, Nikki, that we've been saying very similar sorts of things there. But it's engaging in these other systems to be able to provide employment both locally and see how much we need to be eating of these global food supplies to make sure that we're actually still supporting global communities around the world, or at least supporting them enough to be able to say that we are not leaving anybody in the globe without income coming through there. And I think there's definitely tensions there around how much fruits and vegetables that are coming from overseas versus how much that's coming from within, because we need to factor all this in. And just to highlight as well that the impact of transport, if it's sea-based transport, is only 1 to 5% of impacts for most foods. The foods that have high freight impacts are things like asparagus or things like maybe even blueberries if they're flown in. because flight impacts are drastically huge compared to other transport impacts, so water-based impacts, say for bananas, are ridiculously small because it's all atmosphere controlled. And so it's only 1 to 5% of total environmental impact, even now, is by the transportation of those foods that are sea freighted. So it's very, very small. You know, in some ways, apples or lamb from New Zealand is as small impact as from the UK. And the most perfect example of that, for instance, is tomatoes grown in the UK in a hothouse are higher impact than tomatoes brought over from Spain or Portugal in season or even in tins. So there's definite trade-offs and discussions we need to be having about optimal land use strategy. Sorry, I've been nattering on there. Nikki, do you want to bounce about anything I've said there before we bring Natalie back in?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I just want to mention, and I guess, and this is picking up on one of the questions in the chat, which relates to only using global warming potential as the metric of sustainability. You know, and we have both talked about this as we've gone through the evening, but I think it is really, really important that we don't, you know, only think about what is the emissions attached to that. And also remembering that some of the emissions factors that are used, this is ongoing science. So it is always in, you know, further discoveries are being made, changes to how we're measuring those emissions are always being tweaked and adjusted, and so it's not always an absolute truth or to the most accurate that it could be. It's a version or a point of where we are at the moment, and understanding things like soil erosion, water being moved around the globe from dry arid areas to places that are water abundant doesn't necessarily make sense. And also thinking about other land use issues around deforestation, for example. So sadly, we don't currently have any really effective tools that help us to map that. And again, these are things that are currently happening within the scientific community to develop these tools. And the sooner that we have ways of doing that, then we definitely will be able to make better decisions around the impact, the true holistic, truly environmental impact that doesn't just rely on emissions. Yeah, that's all.
I would just bounce off that, Nikki, and just say that in terms of where we've come over the last decade, you know, I think about this where I was in 2012 and the amount of data available. Like, I could give good estimates. So I could take someone's shopping list in 2012 and give them a carbon footprint, a land footprint, and a water use footprint. And I could do that with the data I had as a researcher in the area and do it okay. We now have data which you can say, oh, you have this production process, it's within this. We now know the UK in terms of, say, beef or milk is very, very efficient compared to global beef production, for instance. And we've carbon footprinted, I think on Farming Today, it was 60% of the UK's farms have good carbon footprint numbers for beef and milk production. And that number is increasing. And, you know, there's an appetite, excuse the pun, to increase those different sorts of things and to increase the knowledge, because if farmers gain these different bits of knowledge, they want to optimize, they want to cut costs, they want to see where they're doing this. And, you know, in previous studies around this, if you give farmers the numbers, they want to improve. And on average, farmers improve by about 12% reduction. That's amazing if you think of that in terms of a food system, if everybody on average was to improve their processes by 12%. And just to think about that there, yes, the UK is improving and is on the good end, but we have a wide range of numbers still there. So if I can give an example of something we've not really touched on tonight, is sustainable fats. And it's kind of, it's not the elephant in the room, but it's one of these things we don't talk about much. And it's very relevant with the Ukraine crisis right now, because Ukraine is where we get a lot of sunflower oil from. And for different sorts of fat, so butter, for instance, there's a wide range of carbon footprint information available for butter. Nobody's really nailed it down yet. And estimates range from, say, about 33 kilograms per kilo of carbon dioxide equivalent to about 10 to 15 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilo of butter. So 30 compared to 10 to 15. That can be a half depending where you're producing it globally. And so if you're thinking in terms of baking a cake, butter is the big thing there, or in terms of on your toast, butter is the big thing there. But depending how it's produced and the numbers you're using, these can result in very big differences in terms of impacts. And so if we're thinking in terms of Ukraine, and as Nikki said, this is moments in time, and this is the best information we have currently. And so that's definitely why we're saying you've got to decrease certain things, increase things, and do the best that we all can. And we're all humans going through this, trying to do the best possible job we have with the information available. But thankfully, farmers are getting more information, policymakers are getting more information, and we as individual citizens are getting more information so we can take control and engage with the wider food system in the best possible way we can. I'll be quiet because Natalie's on screen, so he's probably wanting to talk.
Well, I'm just going to say, I think we've been going for an hour. We've held our audience despite my undoubtedly absolutely dreadful audio and complex backgrounds. And I want to say an enormous thank you to the two speakers, Nikki and Christian, who've done a great job under these very difficult circumstances. And I think that's really a very positive point to end on, is that we're collecting the information, we have the ways to go forwards. I think an hour is long enough for a Zoom. But this is, as Joe was saying, this is a conversation we can continue on Twitter, on other social media. A recording of this will go up so people can go back to it and refer to it. And I think this is a point to say we're not really concerned about individual behaviour so much as system change, making it easiest, cheapest, simplest, and indeed possible, as we were talking about, for people to have a healthy diet and have a planet to live on as well. So it's a very positive place to end on. If we were in a real room, we'd now be giving a huge and rousing applause to Nikki and Christian. So we'll just have to imagine that. I'm going to say thank you very much to the audience for sticking with us despite the technical problems. And I'm going to hand back to Joe from the Festival of Debate now. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and especially coming live and direct from the train and changing location. There might actually be a festival debate first there. So yeah, thank you again to all of our panelists and to our audience. And yeah, let's continue the conversation on Twitter and on socials. And please do check out future festival debate events. We've got George Monbiot coming up on the 23rd of June in person in Sheffield at the Octagon Centre. He'll be talking about his new book, Regenesis, which is all about soil ecology and, of course, sustainable food and best practices in food systems. So please do check that out as well. That's it from us. Thanks, everyone. Good night.